Hello, everyone. My name is James McKinney. I'm a minister at Prestonwood Baptist Church in Prosper, Texas, and future author of a book that's coming out hopefully within the next few weeks. Whenever it does come out, I'll make sure I put a link in the comments to this video. But just recently at our church, we had every single life group, over 1,000 parents and adults, going through a lesson on heart-centered parenting. Parenting is challenging. It is so hard, and sometimes it is so unforgiving. I'm a parent of two. I have a 17 and a 15-year-old, and this lesson that we went through was so helpful for so many that I wanted to put it out there for all of you to enjoy. So there is a listening guide link to the PDF below this video, so I would encourage you to print that out and go through it. If you are a single parent, this will be highly beneficial to you. If you're a married parent, I would encourage you to go through this with your spouse. If you are a parent of teenagers, I would probably say middle school and up, then go through this with them as well. This is going to be of great benefit, and you implement these tactics into your home, I guarantee you, you will see great change from day one. I hope you're blessed by it. I've been married for 22 years, and I'm blessed with two incredible kids. And I say that because we're in a really sweet place right now as my daughter's in her senior year of high school preparing to head off for college, and my son is in his freshman year of high school. Now, had we had this lesson 4 years ago, I might not be speaking such nice words of praise about them. The middle school years were so incredibly challenging for us. But I'm sure I'm the only one this is true for, just my family. Y'all are living the dream, right? Well, I'm always saying that parenting is not for the weak. And it's real. I mean, parenting is super challenging. And there are some seasons that are so incredibly unrewarding. But then there are those moments when your teenager just randomly grabs your wife's hand while walking through the mall, or your 6-year-old just jumps into your lap to just snuggle and then falls asleep right there. And then all of a sudden you forget all about their tyrannical behavior just 20 minutes earlier. Now, if we can have a moment of authenticity, parenting is the worst game of telephone ever. Think about it. How did you become equipped for parenting? I mean, our approach to parenting usually begins with what was modeled for us by our parents. But when we were raised is how we're taking that, bringing it into our marriage. We take the model and make some adjustments from the things that we didn't like that our parents did, and we bring those into our parenting tactics. Well, our spouse does the exact same thing. And guess what? Your parents did the same thing for you, and your spouse's parents. Then you throw in all the mixed messaging we receive in self-help books, and of course, we're going to find ourselves confused and oftentimes so discouraged because we don't know where to go to for instructions that lead to lasting change. Well, guess what? God gave us the game plan already, and that's what we're going to talk about today. First things first, though, let's look at what the Lord tells us in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 6. Now, this is the commandment, the statutes and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son's son, by keeping all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you, all the days of your life, and that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children and shall talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. These verses remind us that biblical parents must be intentional. These verses speak to the level of intentionality we're to place in our parenting of our kids. In fact, verses 5 and 6 really emphasize the level of priority the Lord's teaching is to play in our parenting. Verse 5 says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And 6 says, and these words that I command you shall be on your heart. See, we're to love him with all our heart and to ensure the Lord's teachings are on our heart. So before we go any farther, let's make sure we have a very clear understanding of the heart as it is spoken of and addressed throughout the scriptures. In fact, these verses we read from in Deuteronomy is from a section of a well-known prayer that the Jewish people prayed every morning and every evening for centuries. and still do. And that prayer is called the Shema. Throughout the history of the world, every culture had its own thoughts on how the heart worked and what it was for. For the Israelites, however, they knew the heart was an organ in the chest that sustained life. And we know this because in 1 Samuel 25:37, we read of an individual who had a heart attack. Another belief the Israelites had as it relates to the heart is that they believed all decisions and morality derived from the heart. Within the pages of Scripture, we read numerous verses that speak to believe in your heart. We get that out of Romans 10:9. And Jeremiah 17:9 shows us that it is the heart where connections and understanding is made. And in the entire book of Proverbs, we see that it is where the heart that wisdom dwells. Throughout the Scriptures, the heart is where we think and make sense of the world. So, while the Israelites acknowledge that the heart is an organ that keeps us alive, we also see so much more to the heart. In fact, the words of Jesus in Luke 6:45 speak to the relationship between our heart and our behavior. So when we read the verses out of Deuteronomy, the Israelites and us are being urged to chase after the things of God and to let that chase change our behavior forever. Moses, the author of Deuteronomy, is urging the Israelites to live a changed life in light of how God saved them from slavery and decades of wandering. Even more so, he's urging them to teach these truths to their kids so that they share the same devotion to God despite not having experienced the same journey with God directly. Now, the reason these verses call us to love God with our heart, soul, and might is so that every aspect of our being, our heart, is grounded on all things of God. Because within the Scriptures, our heart is the center of our existence. That is why Proverbs 4:23 warns us so clearly to, above all else, guard our heart, for everything you do flows from it. It is from our heart that our life is sustained. We discern right and wrong. We experience fear, depression, anxiety, and joy. The heart of the Scriptures is where we make decisions and where desires originate. The heart is also something that the enemy can influence and manipulate us towards evil. This truth leads us to focus on heart-centered parenting. Earlier I mentioned about some teachings of Jesus in Luke 6:45. Well, those verses read, "The good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks." In the verses surrounding this verse, Jesus speaks to many different behavioral issues that are common to all of us. Issues such as loving and caring for people we like and those we don't like. He talks about the harm we experience in judging others while warning about being aware of our own shortcomings. He even talks about the upside of living a life built upon His truth, but not just an acceptance of His truth, but a full devotion to His truth. In this verse, Jesus, in full clarity, tells us that it is the contents of our heart that produce our behavior and words. So if Jesus has identified that the heart is a source of behavior, then let's shift our attention to what is within the heart. Because if we want to change behavior, we need to change the contents of our heart. But what is it that's in our hearts? Well, as uncomfortable as it might be, our heart is full of sinful and righteous desires. And we see this truth when we read Galatians 5:24-25. It says, "And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. And if we live by the Spirit, let us also keep in step with the Spirit." It's a humbling reality. But as long as you and I are breathing, sinful desires are going to create challenges for us. Because it's our desires, both good and bad, that take up real estate in our heart. The goal over time is that the desires of our heart will become more in step with that of the Spirit within us than of the flesh. And that's what Paul is highlighting for us in those verses in Galatians. See, Paul is telling us that those that have surrendered their lives to Jesus Christ, that the enslavement to sin that once held us bondage has been crucified. We now have the ability to pursue righteousness, but he then goes on to add a condition to it with if. See, there's a premise to the promise. We have to do the work and live by the Spirit. And as we keep in step with the Spirit, the prominence of the righteous desires within our heart will overpower the sinful desires. Again, if we are breathing, we are sinning. But walking in step with the Spirit over time strengthens us in our pursuit to be more like Jesus. So is it simply our desires that drive our behavior? Well, the answer is no. And thank goodness for that, because again, we're sinners and our desires will always be a mix of righteous and sinful. So knowing that both sinful and righteous desires are going to take up real estate in our heart, how is it determined which desires will drive our behavior and or our words? Well, the answer is revealed to us in Proverbs 3:5-7. Verse 5 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil." See, within these 3 verses, we see 2 very clear decision filters that reside within our heart. The first is a filter of perspective, and the second is a filter of values. Let's discuss the perspective filter first. Perspective reveals how we believe the world works. It is this filter that stops us from jumping out of a plane at 30,000 feet without a parachute, because we understand that gravity is a real aspect of the world that we live in. Within Proverbs 3:5, we are told very clearly that we are not to lean on our own understanding and that we need to trust in the Lord with all of our heart. With everything in our being, we need to acknowledge the reality that we do not fully understand everything about how the world works. We are not the creator of the universe, and it is foolish of us to assume we have a full understanding of his created world. In fact, Isaiah 55:8-9 also speaks to this truth. It reads, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, and neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." So if the scriptures reveal to us that our perspective of how the world works might not be exactly aligned with God's perspective, what is it that shapes our perspective? Or in other words, how do we develop our understanding of how the world works? Well, there are many things in our world that shape our perspective, starting with our own family upbringing. Yes, our own mom and dad shaped how we think the world works. Other perspective shapers are media, culture, our overall personal experience, and of course, the Bible shapes our perspective. Unfortunately, most Christians give more significance to their personal experience than the Bible when it comes to shaping perspective. Don't believe me? Just look at the category of premarital sex. In 2011, a Christian magazine reported that 80% of self-identified Christians have had sex before marriage. At the time of this survey, the non-Christian segment reported back with 88% of having had sex before marriage. The scriptures speak very clearly that sex is to be reserved for marriage. So why would 80% of Christians be having sex outside of marriage? Well, James 1 verses 14-15 give us a glimpse as to why this would be. Those verses read, "But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." The reason that the Christian perspective on premarital sex is no different than that of an unbelieving world is that consequences are not always experienced immediately. See, James uses the term fully grown. This image points to the reality of a process. And I can assure you that if Christians experienced immediate consequences the moment they had sex outside of marriage, their perspective would be drastically different. But because consequences are not always experienced immediately, we begin to develop a perspective that is ill-conceived. That is the process that James speaks to in those verses. And luckily for us, our God doesn't want a relationship derived out of compliance, but one built upon love and obedience. So while we might not experience immediate consequences for living outside of his design, we have to trust that his design is best. And while we might not agree or even fully understand his design, we need to know that it's his design and his will that is best, and we need to obey. It is that repeated acknowledgement that helps us to develop a perspective more closely aligned to God's design. And we have to remember though, perspective is not the only filter contained in our heart. The other filter is our values. And that is what Proverbs 3:6-7 speaks of. And again, those verses read, "In all your ways, submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes, but fear the Lord and shun evil." See, when we talk about values, we need to understand that our values reveal what is most important to us. To go back to the premarital sex discussion, is there a chance that a believer might not actually know what the Bible calls us to as far as purity until marriage? I mean, yeah, I guess there's a chance, but if there's anything the church has messaged really well, it's just that. So the issue is not that Christians don't know what the command is, but that they value self-gratification far more than obedience. Let me be clear though. This is true for every single one of us. Every time we exhibit a behavior that is in opposition to God's teaching and design, we are choosing self over obedience. This was just as true in the Garden of Eden as it is now. In fact, Pastor Connor Bales coined a term for this that I have written on a Post-it note because it is a term that summarizes the core issue perfectly. Pastor Connor calls it the sin of autonomy. See, the sin of autonomy is predicated on elevating ourselves above God's teaching, above God's design, and even above God himself. The sin of autonomy places self above everything, and it is the sin of autonomy that has us believing that we are accountable to nothing or nobody. Every single one of us battles the sin of autonomy, and we exercise this sin every time we choose to value self over obedience to God. Now, just like there are numerous things that shape our perspective, there are also numerous things that we value. Now, aside from self-gratification, we value public opinion, we value importance, we value entertainment, happiness, inclusion, we value comfort, peace, and yes, we even value honoring God. The problem, though, is that more often than not, we value one of those other categories far more than we value honoring God. Every single one of us values various things in varying degrees of significance. But within the United States, entertainment and inclusion sure do rank very high for so many of us. Don't believe me? Gather a collection of friends that claim Jesus is their Lord and Savior and ask them if they've watched numerous episodes of Game of Thrones, True Blood, or most recently Euphoria. And if they're honest, I'm willing to bet that many, if not most, will say yes. But those television series, they gain massive popularity and were constantly talked about in the hallways of offices, schools, and even in online forums. Again, we value inclusion. We place a high value on entertainment as well, and so much of what we consume within media does not serve us well, nor does it bring God glory. Yet, we still consume it because we value entertainment. Now, I want to share a personal example of how our perspective and values truly do drive our behavior. And while it might not be specific to entertainment, it is one that my wife and I journey through personally. And I want to be very transparent with you about this because it's something, this whole model is something you will carry with you for the rest of your life. See, for us, the church has always been significant in the life of my wife and I. And we've known about how important it is to model to our kids God's call to participate in the work of the church. And because of my years as a youth pastor, we also knew that there was going to be a time in which our perspective and values as it related to youth sports and the church were going to be challenged. That is actually why we delayed our son from playing travel ball for so long. See, travel ball is what they called select in Southern California. Well, one summer, my son was invited to play on a travel ball team for a fall mini season where no travel was required. So it was a pretty easy entryway for us. We were so honored for our son, as if we had anything to do with it, that we accepted the invitation. Well, the success continued, the tournaments continued, and lo and behold, we found ourselves on a travel ball team. It was a slow progression, it was a slow progress that happened because of the appeal of having our son be such an amazing athlete that he would be asked to play on a travel team, as if it was a merit badge or a badge of honor that I got to carry around as a dad. It was then that my wife and I set a rule that we would only miss church one Sunday a month for baseball. Well, about 3 months into this journey, the Holy Spirit prompted me with a conviction to look at my family calendar. And in doing so, I realized that while neither my wife or I had missed more than one Sunday a month, my son had been missing more than half the Sundays each month because we kept coordinating rides for him so that we could be at church because that was our rule. Now, immediately, my wife and I had a decision to make. The moment we realized we were off tilt, do we hold the truth that God lays out for us in His Word about the importance of raising our kids in the way that our family priorities are to mirror His priorities, and therefore require us to share our boundaries and guidelines with the coaching staff and risk being kicked off? Or do we continue on the path we were because I don't want to teach my son that it's okay to quit on your team? Well, both are valuable lessons, but both lessons are based on two different values. The first is based on valuing the truth of God and His priorities. And if we're really honest, the second is based on valuing the opinion of others. It's not really about grit and perseverance. Well, because of the perspective of priorities that my wife and I share and the value we place on honoring God with our lives and our parenting, we approached the coaching staff and shared what our family guidelines were. In that conversation, we communicated that if they wanted our son to be part of the team, they would have to be agreeable to our family priorities. Well, long story short, they were agreeable. And there's so much more to discuss on just the topic of parenting through youth sports with a biblical perspective that we can't even cover it in just one lesson. But one last thing on this specific situation. After our conversation with the coaching staff, we shared everything with our kids to show them how real life plays out so that their perspective and value filters can be shaped in alignment with God's. I want to be real with you though. My wife and I do not always get the heart-centered parenting right, but this time we did. So before we wrap up, I want to encourage you to lean in on this truth and bring it into your lives, your marriages, and your parenting. Because lasting behavioral change needs to focus on the individual's heart, not their actions. As a follower of Jesus Christ, our main goal in life is found in the greatest commandment. Jesus lays this main goal out very clearly in Matthew 22, 36 through 40, when he's approached with a question. Those verses read, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." As a parent, we are raising future adults. So if our main purpose, as laid out by Jesus Christ, is to love God and love others, then we need to be raising our kids towards this main purpose as well. As we raise, as we discipline, as we correct, and even as we praise, and even as we simply hang out, we need to be showing our kids the perspective and values of God, all of which is found in His Word. Everything we need is contained right here.